You're about to enter into a new world of knowledge, curiosities, and high strangeness. This is a podcast of Straight Up Strange Productions.
You're listening to Mysteries and Monsters. I'm your host, Paul Bestall. Strange stories from the Old West await us on this episode as John LeMay returns to share some of the stories from his most recent books, Cowboys and Zombies, as well as Llorona, her kith and kin. We've ghostly headless horsemen, vampire babies, a real-life 20th century vampire flap, and the multiple versions of La Llorona that deviate wildly from town to town. A big thank you as always to John for joining me once again. But before we hear from him, don't forget you can support Mysteries and Monsters by signing up at patreon.com/Mysteries and Monsters. $4 a month gets you ad-free episodes, guaranteed early releases, bonus content, and more. And you can also click the link in the show notes as well. A big thank you to my latest patron, Veronica, and thank you to each and every one of you that continue to support the show with your contributions. It means a great deal. Mysteries and Monsters is across most social media platforms. Please subscribe to the Mysteries and Monsters channel on YouTube. You can also visit mysteriesandmonsters.com for episodes and news, and our exclusive merchandise site is available via TeePublic, and you'll find the link for that in the show notes too. Our intro and outro music are performed by the marvellous Weary Pines. Thank you as always to Dean Bestall for his wonderful artwork, and the show is produced by Brennan Storr of the Ghost Story Guys. It's time to saddle up and head out in the company of John LeMay as we search for the strange. One of the stranger aspects of Old West folklore is the number of stories involving encounters with revenants. This term covered all manner of strange creatures, from vampires to mummies and even werewolves. But it seems these monsters were simply the tip of the iceberg. Joining me once again to cover some of the cases included in his latest book, Cowboys and Zombies, Vampires, Werewolves and Revenants of the Range, is our good friend, John LeMay. John, a long overdue welcome back. How are we?
It's good to be talking with you from across the pond, as they say, Paul. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. The second interviewer I've spoken to today who has used that term. So we are all very familiar with that, and it's always a pleasure. John.
No. So no, I'm passé.
The one thing I can always say about you, John, is you are nowhere near passé, my friend. You are always bringing us fresh and wonderful tales that you have uncovered. And once again, here we have a marvellous collection of all manner of weirdness. And I have to wonder where on earth you keep discovering these wonderful stories from.
They seem to just come to me at this point, and I think oftentimes how I really stumble across them is I'm working on another book entirely. And I come across these stories by accident, really. And in the case of this one, I'd already done a book called Cowboys and Monsters, which was all about things like vampires in the Old West and mummified remains that we could call, mummies like the Universal horror movies. And I'd already done that one, but again, I just would stumble across these other stories. And so that's why my newest book, originally, I titled it Cowboys and Monsters, The Lost Cases. And that's kind of a cool title, but as I really looked through the story, I had at least 3 or 4 that could have qualified as zombies. So I went ahead and called this one Cowboys and Zombies, just because that's kind of a cooler title.
Well, it certainly is. It hooks you in, because straight away your mind begins to conjure images of what could be shuffling across the plains of the Old West back in the mid-19th century, John.
Yes, and something I always tell people is a lot of our concepts of monsters today come from movies. Like vampires, and this idea that, a vampire bites you and you become a vampire, or a werewolf bites you and you become a werewolf. That's more from the movies. And in real life, if we can say that, or real life folklore, most vampires and werewolves were just witches who did rituals to transform into animals or drink blood. And I guess by the same token, in the Old West, maybe they didn't really have what we would today call zombies, which is a reanimated corpse that wants to eat flesh. That's more of a movie thing. But back then, this is a really outdated term, but the term is revenant. And a revenant was like someone who came back from the dead. So they did have, revenants who should have been dead, but people would still see them. So they weren't really ghosts, and they were flesh and blood. And I just did my best to find all the stories that I could, so I could make the title as true as I could without it being totally misleading.
Mm. Well, revenant's a strange term, John, like you refer to there, because up until essentially the latter part of the 19th century, that's the term that people use when they were discussing stories about people coming back from the dead. They were always classed as revenants. And we have a very famous location here in England called Warren Percy, which is an old sort of middle-aged village that was abandoned for some reason. And people were always mystified as to why until they found the graves. And it's the only revenant burial site that's been uncovered in the United Kingdom so far as I'm aware, John. And everybody in these graves had all had sort of stakes stuck through their rib cages and bricks put through their mouths because people believed that the people of Warren Percy were turning into revenants, which as we would know them now is vampires.
Wow, I'd never heard that. And I mean, I'm not planning on doing it myself. I try to just stick to what I know in North America, but has anybody written about that cemetery yet?
No, it's only kind of been touched on in a couple of documentaries, more to do with archaeology than anything else. But it's a fascinating story, and it's a fairly recent one. I think it was only discovered about 15 years ago, John. When we finish, I'll dig out a couple of articles and send you them over so you can have a look, sir.
Wow, well, I love English vampire, whatever stories like Spring-Heeled Jack I really enjoyed. So I was thrilled when Spring-Heeled Jack came over to America for a while. And yes, what is it, the Highgate vampire? Oh. Hightail, what is it?
Highgate vampire, yeah, that's one of my favourite strange stories. And a fairly recent one, because that happened in 1970.
Wow. Yeah, I just remember the name and vague details, but I think it's, quite a story too.
Yeah. Strangely, during one of my recent trips to London, we were bored. We didn't have anything planned for the Sunday evening when we were in the hotel, so we were watching television, and it was Halloween weekend, John, anyway. And there ended up being a documentary about Highgate and the Highgate vampire case whilst we were there. And my girlfriend had to try her very best to convince me that taking a taxi at 9 o'clock across London to try and visit Highgate Cemetery was probably not the best idea I've ever had, sir.
Yeah.
Well, I suppose one of the strange facets, I think, about American literature and American scary stories is this, I wouldn't say it's an obsession, but probably one of the most well-known Headless Horseman stories is obviously Washington Irving's The Horseman of Sleepy Hollow, which has been turned into a film, Sleepy Hollow, obviously starring Johnny Depp, a marvellous and rather creepy gothic horror version of Irving's tale. And the first story you have in this particular book is this wonderful story about the Headless Horseman of Texas, El Muerto, the Dead, which is incredible. And when you read the story, about 3/4 of the way through, you drop a bombshell on us, John, and you say, well, actually, what the story is, or what the story was, are very different things. And it's a very intricate and interesting, I don't know, as you say in there, it's one of those sort of stories that seems to change every time somebody prints it. Little bits keep getting added to it. And I would imagine, when you discover a story like this, is it harder to unpick the origin of it than it would be for a modern tale we can tend to utilise when certain things appear? We have more resources at hand these days, John, whereas I would imagine for yourself, when you're looking into the history of El Muerto, you will have to sort of try and use both original newspaper accounts that were popping up in the late 19th century, I would imagine, against some of the sort of stories that were published in collections and books in the early part of the 20th century.
Yes, I wholeheartedly agree. And I think what happens sometimes with authors like me and others is, and especially back then, pre-internet, they would just write what they remembered in their head, which may not have been what the person told them or what the book they read actually said. And so they would create a slight variation to these stories purely on accident. But then because it appeared in the written word, and we're all kind of programmed and conditioned that anything you see in writing, it must be official, it must be true. And so I think that's how these stories get so mixed up over time. It's purely by accident in many cases, although some people, exaggerate them on purpose. But I think many times it's just accidental. They misremembered this or that, and the story gets kind of confused.
I suppose as well, for you, is that part of the joy of uncovering these stories, John, is unpicking the modern version compared to the origin? Because obviously there are some alleged more recent sightings which seem to bear very little resemblance to what anybody was reporting back in the origin story. Or is it a sort of bone of frustration sometimes for yourself and other researchers that you're having to pick through these exaggerated embellishments on the origin story? Because the original story itself, in my opinion, doesn't need all this decorative language and additional sort of superficial abilities that this Headless Horseman was supposed to have.
Yes, so I would say I actually enjoy it when there's different versions that I can pick through and connect dots with, because the thing about me when I write these old stories, I technically can't really turn up anything new. Now, the only way I could turn up something new is if I met an actual witness who told me their story of the Headless Horseman, and typically that doesn't happen. So all I can really do is just organize the information in such a way that maybe other people haven't, and just try to do my best to reconstruct the story. And I do want to say, just so I don't steal anybody else's thunder, when it came to the Headless Horseman chapter I wrote, I really didn't have to reconstruct anything. I'm looking at the book right now because I want to get her name. It was Luann Herda. She wrote an article called Evolution of a Legend, and she's the one who really did such a great job of corralling all the different versions of the legend and kind of seeing how it evolved over time. So in that case, she gets all the credit, and I just, kind of followed what she did and then tried to find new things maybe she didn't mention. But overall, she really reconstructed the legend.
So for anybody who's unaware of El Muerto and the strange incidents that seem to be occurring, this happens at a very volatile part of American-Mexican relations, shall we say. Obviously, it sort of seems to appear after the culmination of the Mexican-American War of the 1840s, John, and these stories start beginning. So is it one of these stories that you think a lot of people in Texas and surrounding states are aware of, or has it become one of those old tales that only certain people of a certain vintage recall?
I think it's the latter, unfortunately. I think it's kind of being forgotten, so hopefully I can do my part to keep it out there. And what I find so fascinating about the Texas Headless Horseman is there's more pedigree to it than Washington Irving's story. It's so Washington Irving, he wrote the story and it became very popular due to like the Disney adaptation and the Johnny Depp movie. But the Headless Horseman of Texas has this gargantuan novel devoted to it by Captain Mayne Reid. And it was based on the real stories that Mayne Reid heard when he was a soldier at Fort Inge, I think it was called, because he heard about this Headless Horseman firsthand. And his novel, gosh, it's like several 100,000 words. It's huge. I couldn't even read all of it. And it was very popular. Back when it was written in the 1860s, super popular book, and it just never carried over into the modern day. I mean, you can still buy it on Amazon if you want, but it's not widely read today. And the real story, though, of the Headless Horseman that inspired his novel, they think really happened. And as you said, it started back in the aftermath of the Mexican-American War. There was a former Mexican soldier who had become a horse rustler, and I think he went by the name of Vidal. And the story in a nutshell, without just giving all of it away, is he stole some horses from a wealthy horse owner, and there's different versions on who tracked him down. But the general consensus is that General Bigfoot Lew Wallace was the man who captured this rustler named Vidal. And there was so much rampant rustling back then, they wanted to make an example out of this guy. So they decided that after they killed him, they would behead his body. And then they found a way of fastening his headless corpse to a wild Mustang. And this allegedly really happened. And of course, when I say Mustang, I mean the breed of horse, just for anybody who might not, know that Mustang can also refer to a horse. So they strapped his rigid, dead corpse to this Mustang, and they also tied the severed head to the body, so it kind of swung around from the saddle. And, they set the horse loose, and it ran around with this dead body strapped to the back of it for nobody really knows how long, but people were seeing this headless rider, and it wasn't an apparition, and it wasn't a ghost. It was literally, apparently, a corpse strapped to this horse. And finally, some ranchers did catch the Mustang, and they mercifully, cut off the ropes that were binding the body and set this poor horse free. And then they buried the rustler. And then, of course, after that, they started to see his ghost riding across Texas, to this day and all that, allegedly. So that's the short version for our listeners.
And it's interesting that the original events are clearly real. This happened. This rustler was caught, treated in this sort of frontier justice type of way, and yet it seems it takes about 60 years, and then everybody they start moving people around, because this is the other aspect of it, is that in essence, the version that everybody tends to know, none of the people who were actually sort of involved in the capture and punishment of this rustler were actually there.
No, and that Luann Herda, who investigated it, she said that those people claimed it really did happen, and as far as they understood it, it was a real event. Of course, nobody can prove the ghost sightings, but the bit about the corpse being strapped to the horse, somehow they claim that really happened.
Were you surprised to see some modern sightings of this? Because as I was joking, it seems to have gone through one of these sort of modern upgrades, John, where before, the fact that you would see a headless corpse sort of wandering around the frontier on a ghostly horse would be frightening for most people if you stumbled across that at the small hours of the morning. And yet now it seems to be sort of fiery coals for eyes and the horses breathing fire.
Yeah, that's crazy. That's obviously where people, I guess, add to it over time just to make it more interesting.
I think one of the things that struck me when I read that particular chapter is straight away I was thinking, this really reminds me of the Red Ghost stories, which is obviously this infamous camel that was on the run in Arizona in I think it was the 1880s till about 1890, John?
That sounds right, yeah.
With and people were claiming that they were seeing this weird creature, because this is the other thing at the end of the day, it's a camel in America. I don't think many people in Arizona in 1880 would know what a camel was, ironically. And strangely enough, the reason we found out what had happened was that somebody went, what the bloody hell's that, and shot it.
Yeah.
But this was a story of people who were claiming, prospectors and ranchers were saying that they would be sitting around their camps having some food at the end of the day. And all of a sudden this monstrosity with a skeleton on the back would come pounding through their camp, scattering everybody. Everybody would be terrified. And eventually, as I say, one group of ranchers encountered it, took a few shots, missed the camel, but blew the head off the skeleton, which they were then able to say, actually, right, we've got a skeleton here, because there was still bits of hair and skin attached to it, I believe. And then a few months later, another rancher saw the creature in his garden eating his plants, and so he shot it. But it had still got the saddle and the straps on. And so, once again, I've seen versions of that story that have been printed in the last sort of 20 years. And all the origin of it seems to have been completely changed, and they've created this invented history of how this event happened. But clearly, at that time, people were trying to think of how they could get across certain parts of the lower US with its desert landscapes, John. And for some people, they were thinking, well, obviously, we know camels do this in Africa. It'll make a great use of a pack animal to bring them over to these uncharted lands here. And that's probably what started that off, because obviously, on top of all that, you've still got these reports of ghosts of camels wandering around and herds of mysterious camels people still claim to come across there.
Yeah, that's fascinating. The idea of ghost steers and ghost camels and animals as opposed to people, I think that's very distinctively Southwest.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the thing about the Headless Horseman is obviously we know that people removed the corpse from the horse's back. But then when people start seeing the ghost, the horse is there as well. So has he caught himself a ghost in the afterlife, John, and thought, I'm going to use that? Or did the horse pass away and then they came back together in the afterlife? Who knows?
That's what I thought too. It's like, yeah, it gets a little convoluted at that point.
Yeah, I think I'm thinking too much about it, John, if I'm honest.
Yeah, we're giving it too much credit. Yeah.
Yes, I don't think there's a...
But yeah. Well, we don't know the science of ghosts, and I was just thinking, what if ghosts aren't really ghosts and they're like a time slip?
Mm.
Like people that say they see dinosaurs today. Well, what if it was just sort of like the ghost of a dinosaur or an actual dinosaur? What if it was like just an anomaly in the time stream where somehow this image from the past is visible before us now? So maybe the people that see the Headless Horseman, maybe it's not the ghost, maybe it's just, like a glimpse into the past because we don't understand all the physics of time and all that. Absolutely.
I think we know even more about how time works in other dimensions, John, in the last 20 years than people would have even considered when these stories first started appearing. And now, of course, we understand that there's all kinds of aspects to both this that we don't understand. And why not? That seems like a completely plausible explanation, that on occasions there could be windows into the past where we see these weird things. We don't know.
Yeah.
I suppose with this as well, it's a classic tale. And it seems to be, with some of these stories, there are good examples of this. Obviously, as we've mentioned, the most famous example of this story is Washington Irving's. But this is not the only sort of Headless Horseman story from the US and also your particular writing area, John, because they do seem to pop up from now and again, don't they?
I actually had several Headless Horsemen in this book, and what's so interesting is they really do qualify more as revenants and zombies than they do ghosts. Now, one of them, it was, I can't remember the tribe, but one of the indigenous peoples, Native Americans, his name was Mouse's Road. I don't know why he had that name, Mouse's Road. Mm-hmm. And he was in a fight with a rival tribe, and in the fight they decapitated him, and he fell to the ground, but then his corpse sat back up without the head, and they tell it like this is a real story. This really happened. And people kind of debate, well, how could that be possible? And were some of the nervous systems in this body somehow still functioning without the head? But the story went that when they saw this headless man sit back up after he'd been killed, that scared everybody off and they all ran away. And so that's another allegedly true story. And then there's also a Headless Horseman in the Kiamichi Mountains of Oklahoma, I think it was called. The problem with me in these books is Cowboys and Zombies I did who knows when, but like over half a year ago, I think by now. So I've kind of forgotten some of my details is the problem with me. So I'm kind of just rambling on from my memory, but there's some sort of a Headless Horseman somewhere in Oklahoma who guards a treasure, and it's in the book.
Mm. Yeah, well, we've got several wandering around over here, but obviously not as ghoulish as some of these that you've uncovered, John. So, there's always death and murder involved in them in some aspects. But, for some reason, these seem a little bit more well-documented because, like I say, clearly something happened and clearly someone met a very unfortunate end, or some would say he got his just desserts. So the origin stories, without sort of question, it's everything that follows afterwards. And, that'd be one hell of a thing to kind of stumble across if you're having a nice late-time stroll somewhere in Texas when that comes sort of powering past you at 2 a.m.
Yeah. Yeah, there's such a, I mean, in terms of horror films, there's such a fantastic visual, and there's so many of them. I think I could probably do a whole book just on Headless Horseman of the Americas or something like that.
Very true. I mean, one of the other wonderful stories that starts the book off is these incredible crimes that seem to be going on where graves were being sort of desecrated, John, and the skulls were being removed. And this, as I said before we started, this is a wonderful sort of supernatural detective story, because this is one where, once again, we have documented evidence of what was going on. And the local community seemed absolutely terrified, both settlers and the indigenous tribes of the area, because something weird was going on. And it seemed like you have a culmination of supernatural responses to dealing with this situation, added to a bit of sort of frontiersman grit and determination to get to the bottom of this heinous crime.
So, like I said earlier, the thing about me is I don't think I ever really discover anything quote-unquote new. But what I do is I find really cool stuff that people have just forgotten about. And this one, you know, I work in an archive here in Roswell, and we've got every single issue of like Frontier Times and True West. And sometimes I call it panning for gold.
Yes.
I'll just go through them, flip through the pages. You never know what you might find. So I find this story in Frontier Times about a skinwalker. You know, they don't use the word skinwalker because that hasn't become part of our language of vernacular and all that until more recently. But essentially, it's a story about a skinwalker, which, you know, like we think of as, you know, like the Southwestern equivalent of a werewolf.
Yes.
So as you said, in turn of the century Arizona, they had this this outbreak of graves just being desecrated. They would get exhumed, and then whoever was digging up the bodies would cut off their heads and take them away. And, you know, it was mostly around the Navajo Nation. And so, you know, to them, any witch is called a skinwalker. I think they have another, you know, native term for it, but we call it skinwalker.
Yeah.
You know, and it's very much like a werewolf. But again, you know, you don't get bitten to be a skinwalker. You have to do like a dark ritual and wear the pelt of the animal you want to transform into. And that's what really got me about the story is per the real testimony, because this is supposed to be a real, you know, story that actually happened as told by one of the descendants. You know, around these graves, they would find coyote tracks instead of like footprints from people. They were coyote tracks. And in several instances, they witnessed a man wearing a coyote skin digging up the grave, and the hero of the story would take shots at him. And by the story's end, he does kill the skinwalker, and it turns out to be a normal human being. But there's always this supernatural but. Even though it was just a man in the end, this man would always outrun the witness on foot. You know, the witness would be on his horse, and he would lose track of this guy who's only on foot, and he would somehow outrun the horse. And that's, if the man is telling an accurate story and he's not embellishing, I mean, that's, you know, a supernatural occurrence. And that's part of the lore of the skinwalker, is they're really fast.
Well, I think, I mean, when we've spoken previously, and we've covered some very odd stories that seem to have been lost to time, John, for a variety of reasons. Once again, this strikes me quite remarkably in regards to what was going on, because clearly this is one of those aspects where you've got old beliefs meeting the future head on, essentially. Because at the end of the day, what we've got here was someone who was using skulls for personal benefit because they were selling them as magic totems and cures for people, and sort of doing a sort of illegal trade in body parts, which was the kind of thing that people would whisper about late at night or in secluded areas, whereas and sort of in the harsh light of day, people would sort of poo-poo this and say that there wasn't anything going on. But when you read this, there's a real sort of anger in the community, especially from some of the sort of people that have embraced the modern way, as it were, who seem rather frustrated that they can't get to the bottom of it, because for some people they were saying, well, it can't possibly be magic. There must be a human rationale behind it. But essentially it seems to be a wonderful mix of both.
Yes, it's a bit like the old Scooby-Doo episodes where it seems like a monster's at play, and then they unmask him at the end. It was a lot like that. I mean, it was written, well before Scooby-Doo. Again, totally alleged to be a real event. But again, the idea that this guy wearing the coyote skin could outpace the horse and get away from it so quickly is just unreal. And all I really did was when I was really pleased because all I had to go off of was this old Frontier Times article, and I really dug into who the author was, and I found out that the author was using a pen name, and he was the descendant of one of the people in the story who was one of the traders who traded with the Native Americans. And so he got this story from either his dad or his grandfather directly, about this incident that they saw happen and witnessed and took part in. So that was all I was really able to add to it, was give the reader some background on the pedigree of this true Frontier Times article and, why we can kind of vouch for it having actually happened and not having just been some story they made up for fun.
I think as well, not dissimilar to the first wonderfully weird story we've discussed, we've got a central hero in this one, which is this chap Hasker. And when you look at it, some people would say, oh, well, it seems a little bit romanticised and wherever. But I think when you look at overall what was going on in that particular period, and this is the thing, this is the real end of the 19th century. I think this is 1897, 1898 this is going on. So this isn't something sort of from the beginning of the 19th century. This, to some people, is, Queen Victoria is still on the throne in England, John. For some people, I think they are amazed and shocked that you would have incidents like this that, 130 years ago to some people is the blink of an eye, really.
Mm-hmm, yeah. Yeah, well, and in terms of romanticizing it, we have a folklorist here in the Southwest. His name was J. Frank Dobie, and he was notorious for really embellishing and romanticizing his stories. But I think thanks to him doing that, those stories have endured and survived, whereas if he didn't romanticize them, they may not still be remembered today. So it's kind of interesting.
I think what also strikes me about this particular incident is the power of silver, John. And so I think for anybody who doesn't know much about Native American law and specifically the Navajo Nation, is this something that a lot of the tribal nations ascribe power to, things that are sort of supernatural elements? Because obviously for anybody thinking about silver and skinwalkers, they would say, well, this sounds like a film version of how to deal with a werewolf, because obviously silver bullets and werewolves are virtually a film version. There are a couple of cases from Europe where people have used silver to try and hunt certain monsters. The Beast of Gévaudan, I think, is a prime example of one off the top of my head. But some people might be very surprised that it seems as though they're trying to deal with this situation as if you would deal with a werewolf in a film.
I am so glad you brought that up, because that was one thing about the story. I won't say I didn't like it, but it made me kind of do a double take, and it made me a little suspicious. And so I think what could happen there, you've got this guy, I've already forgotten his name, writing the story, probably 50 years later. He may have just misremembered what it was that they used to kill this thing, and he was like, well, in the movies they always use silver, so we'll just go with that. In real Navajo lore, I think to kill a skinwalker, you need something to do with white ash, and I assume that means like the white ashes from a fire, but there's also a white ash tree, and it's kind of unclear, because the Navajo really don't like to talk about it, and this stuff kind of gets out by accident. So yeah, skinwalkers, though, getting killed by silver, that to me is I think kind of something that came from the movies. I don't think it's true to the lore. I think just whoever wrote that story couldn't remember maybe what it was the Navajo man had used.
Yeah.
So that's what I think, because I've never seen silver used very often, and even in like the werewolf vampire stories of the Southwest, typically it wasn't a silver bullet. It was just a bullet that the person etched a crucifix onto, and that's all they would typically do in the real folklore.
But I suppose on the back of that, what is the power of turquoise? or things that are turquoise coloured as well, because obviously one of the things here is that people were saying that whilst the graves were being desecrated and robbed, things, I mean, like we say, silver could be a modern adaptation to give it a bit of sort of attraction to lovers of werewolves and horror films, John. But the turquoise is a very odd thing to kind of leap to, because some people would say, well, what's special about turquoise?
Turquoise, I think, was just valuable. I can't remember if there was anything supernatural about it. That's another problem. Again, when I write these books, so much of what I've written just kind of goes out my mental door as I start working on the next book. That's my problem.
I mean, it is a very pleasing shade. I have to say, I'm very keen on the colour turquoise myself, John. So maybe it was valuable because it was beautiful and quite rare, because this is one of the things that blue things and blue in nature were quite rare until the modern era. So, most languages, as far as I'm aware, a lot of them didn't have a word for blue. And it's kind of a modern interpretation, and it's been sort of adapted into language from what I can gather. I think the Greeks didn't have a word for blue, and neither did the Romans, I think, and they used certain terms. So things like that would be classed as special because they were of a colour that seemed to defy description.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And so the only stories I can really remember about the supernatural and these different metals are stories about gold in regards to the Apache. Because the Apache, how they viewed gold was you shouldn't dig it out of the earth, because if you did, you might anger the earth itself, and that would cause an earthquake because it doesn't like getting dug into. But if you found gold that the earth had already yielded, it was okay to pick it up. But yeah, the Apache regarded gold as very sacred. They hated it when prospectors would come and dig it onto their land looking for gold. And that's another one of the really cool stories I found for this book, was about an Apache medicine man who wanted to resurrect Chief Diablo from the dead to come back and fight the soldiers. Like, not his spirit, but like actually resurrect this Chief Diablo to come and lead their people in a revolt against the soldiers in Arizona. And they were also supposedly casting bullets out of gold because they thought it would be, well, kind of ironic to kill these prospectors with golden bullets. So that's another story I managed to dredge up for the book.
I suppose as well, one of the things that, I mean, the first book of yours I read that mentioned vampires, John, I was quite surprised, because you kind of think, well, how are these tribes and nations aware of what a vampire is? Obviously now I'm fully aware that cultures all around the world have terms and creatures that we would describe in a modern sense as a vampire. But obviously for a lot of Mexican area and the tribal regions around there, they had lots of creatures that to the modern interpretation would be classed as a vampire, but they weren't called such things. And so you have a lot of creatures and strange things that the term vampire only seems to start being attached to them once we get into the 20th century or late 19th century, sort of post-Dracula's success.
Yes, exactly. And my favorite one I can't even pronounce. I've never heard it pronounced, or if I have, I can't remember how to pronounce it myself, but it starts with a T. It's a really long name, and it comes from Tlaxcala, Mexico. Mm. And they're these winged women. They were very bird-like instead of bat-like. They would turn into birds, and they would fly to the kid's house at night and suck its blood, and it was regarded as a real thing because they would list it as the cause of death on these death certificates from the 1950s and the 1960s. So I mean, again, you can't prove there were real vampires, but people really were citing that as a cause of death on official death certificates, which is just unbelievable.
Mm. Yeah. And so you have lots of these stories. And obviously, once again, I mean, I'm a bit disappointed because I didn't know how to pronounce it either, John. I thought you were going to educate me there. So I did not want to butcher the Spanish version of that.
Yeah, I could venture, I guess it's like Talapueche or Pucci?
Yeah.
Talapueche? I don't know. It's a hard one.
Yeah. I think we'll just call her Tally. I think that'll do.
Yeah.
She can be happy with that.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of these kind of sort of vampiric creatures, and you have some very strange sort of ways to deal with them. I mean, I was chuckling about the taking your hat off and sticking a knife into the ground with it. Well, I'm not really sure that'll do much, but we'll give it a go, I suppose, if you've got something like that. But you have lots of these stories, and sometimes even sort of, you could suggest mass panics and hysteria gripping communities where people are claiming that vampires are abroad in the area, picking on both people and cattle.
Yeah, that's where in the Southwest it's hard to decide sometimes if it's aliens from UFOs mutilating the cattle or chupacabras or whatever. It's there's a lot to it, and what drives me nuts is there's authors out there who will make these claims like, oh yeah, Coronado, he claimed he came across chupacabras and this and this, but they don't really list a source that you can go and check for it. You know, and I hate stuff like that. You know, like I feel like when you make that sort of a statement, you need to provide a source. So that's why I'm always really careful about, you know, footnotes and endnotes that tell you where this or that bizarre story came from. And one thing I try really hard not to do is to make a story that I don't think is untrue true. Like if I think a story is not true, I'll just tell you an entertaining story, and then when the chapter closes, I'll be like, but this is why I don't think this really happened, you know, and this is the evidence against it. So a lot of times I just like to tell cool stories, and if I think it's real, I'll defend it, but if I think it's untrue, I'll either not really delve into it too much, or I'll at least say this is why I don't think this happened, but at least it's a cool story.
I think one of the disturbing vampire creatures that you mention in that particular section is the one about the vampire baby that's sort of hiding behind a tombstone in a cemetery. And I'm trying to remember where else there is a very similar sort of story from another tribal nation, John, about creatures that would appear as children and cry to attract humans' attention. And when you get to it, it would sort of suck on your thumb like a sort of comforter, and then it would just basically eat you from the finger up. And you've got this story, which, as you say, could have been called The Vampire Baby of Santa Fe, that seems to be based on a real sort of belief, but once again becomes romanticised and exaggerated in the more modern era once people are all in on vampires such as Dracula.
Yes, now that's a really interesting one, because a lot of these stories are easy to dissect as cautionary tales, like La Llorona, the Wailing Woman. You know, she's a ghost that will supposedly drag children into the water, be it a lake, an irrigation ditch, a river, and she'll drown them. You know, that's obviously a cautionary tale. It's very easy to connect the dots and say, well, that's just a ghost they utilize to keep kids from getting too close to the water. But you have to ask, like, what is the cautionary tale against helping a baby in distress? Because that's the basis of all these stories of what we were just talking about, the vampire baby. There's a bunch of them all across New Mexico and Texas and Arizona where, you know, a guy is riding his horse late at night. He hears a baby crying, and, you know, he wants to do his duty and do the right thing and rescue this baby that's been abandoned. And then the baby will always turn into some sort of a monster or a vampire. And that's what I'm saying, you know, like, why would you have a cautionary tale about saving a baby? You know, and there's all these old stories about a monster of some kind mimicking the voice of a child to lure people to their doom. So it's like, you know, maybe that was a real supernatural occurrence where whatever it was would mimic a child, and it was a cautionary tale not to do that.
Yes. I mean, whenever you release one of these books, I just read it from cover to cover, and there are stories that stick out, and there are stories that make me chuckle. And there are always, as I was saying about this strange sort of adaptation of adding silver into some of these stories in regards to dealing with what were perceived as skinwalkers, John. You've got this wonderful story about a vampire flap in El Paso in 1938, which is obviously quite well known in regards to the furore that was created by Orson Welles when he was doing War of the Worlds. And this is obviously the same year, and it seems that a local radio station down in Juarez, just over the border in Mexico, had started this story that seemed to take hold in El Paso, where people were under the misapprehension that there was a vampire who had killed a child on the loose. And this was one of those stories where somebody must have heard the broadcast and started the story, and it just spread like wildfire, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I think it's such a ironic parallel. It happened the same year as War of the Worlds, and people got excited over a fictional play. And I guess it just goes to show that people in 1938 were still capable of believing in real vampires.
Mm. I mean, there's not much that people aren't finding or saying. Do you think that some of the sort of frontiers people were sort of adding to stories that they would hear at trading posts or when they were doing barterings with the local tribal nations sometimes, John? Or do you think that, obviously I've come across stories and things where I think one of the last times we spoke, we were discussing some of the cases in regards to mummies. And we had to try and quantify that what the mummies that we're talking about in this kind of Mexican Native American culture is not the Western interpretation of a mummy, a sort of resurrected pharaoh from Egypt, because obviously mummification in regards to the passing of people is something that cultures all around the world have used throughout time.
Yeah, I just I thought it was so cool to find these stories about mummified outlaws and cowboys that they never came back to life like the mummies in the movies, but they would always have an interesting history attached to them. Like there was the mummy of John Wilkes Booth that they said was cursed, and then I found a story this time about Billy the Kid being not necessarily mummified, but that this kind of mad scientist guy dug up Billy the Kid right after he got shot and preserved his skeleton and so again it's not really a zombie story, but if you're interested in the Old West and weird stories and the paranormal, it's just one of those things I wanted to include.
I suppose as well, they've got this kind of way of depending on who was writing about certain mummified corpses being discovered here, there and everywhere in certain states, that they were always trying to make them out to be Aztecs, it seems, John. Whether they knew anything about the Aztecs or not, it just seemed to be that was the catch-all explanation as to what these mummies were. Oh, yes, they're all Aztecs, and it must be Montezuma at that.
I'm glad. So you gave me a good opening to promote one of my other more recent books. It's called Pueblo Magic in the Land of Montezuma, and it's all about the myth of Montezuma, the emperor of the Aztecs, being born in North America, specifically in what is today New Mexico, and how he rode down to Mexico on the back of a giant eagle, and he started the Aztec Empire, and all these things that aren't true. And how that myth got started is just a fascinating case of wartime propaganda, both from the Pueblo Revolt of 1680 and also the Mexican-American War of 1848. It was all wartime propaganda that birthed this legend that is just totally not true, but that's why people would oftentimes associate Pueblo culture with the Aztecs. So there's a lot of interesting history to that for certain.
Mm. I mean, it is. I think it's one of those things that as we continue our explorations to the jungles of South America, I think, once again, as I said about some of the Native American and indigenous tribe lore and legends, we clearly look at these in a far more nuanced and balanced way these days, and we're learning a lot more, and there's clearly a lot to discover all over the United States, because often you've got sort of artifacts and constructions that seem to predate what we know as the tribal nations of North America now, and they've always said, well, they were here when we got here, and so people are like, well, who on earth built these? But now you see that we're learning so much more about the Aztecs and the Incas, and as last year, was it last year? Probably the year before now, they discovered this lost city that's completely changed the history of South America now. They've gone from thinking everybody was a hunter-gatherer to understanding that, no, they were building cities 2,000 years ago, and they weren't just sort of wandering around in little groups. And that's what we've discovered in the last couple of years. So what we might know in 20 years' time about certain things and certain tribes, John, it would be very interesting because there are stories of, I believe the Aztecs have a story that the ones that escaped the Spanish all went north, which would be obviously into Mexico and North America now. So you never know, do you? Who knows what we might uncover? But I don't think Montezuma's one of them.
Yeah, yeah, we're all pretty certain Montezuma probably died, during the conquest of Cortez and all that. And that's you can link these strange stories to all sorts of historical events. Even La Llorona, the Wailing Woman, is thought to have been Hernan Cortez's mistress, who translated the conversations between Montezuma and Cortez, and Cortez had an illegitimate child with this woman. Her name was La Malinche, and she was his mistress. And so the story goes is that Cortez wanted to take their son back with him to Spain, but leave her behind, and she was just so bereaved by this possibility that she drowned their son before Cortez could take him, and then she became La Llorona, the Wailing Woman, which not true. That's just a folktale. They know what happened to his mistress and all that, but it's just another one of those folktales that got started. And and again, it's just fascinating how you can tie all these supernatural entities to real events. Absolutely.
Well, I think the last character I want to dive into in this particular book before we touch on a bit more about La Llorona is the Snarly Yow, John. Now, once again, for anybody looking at this with Western eyes, especially European eyes, they'll go, hang on a minute, that sounds a bit like a werewolf. And this is the thing, I think, with some of these, that you come across these creatures and we try to sort of fit them in our sort of modern boxes of what we think these creatures are. But the Snarly Yow seems to be something that is tied to some people for a very specific battle during the American Civil War. But then others are sort of saying, well, we think it's also been brought across by the German immigrants of the 18th century. And so when you were looking into this and coming across it, were you able to sort of unpick the Snarly Yow's sort of effect? Because obviously this is more sort of West Virginia and Maryland, but clearly people believed in it because there's an historical marker about the bloody thing, isn't there?
Yeah, it's always so fascinating. Anytime you can have a UFO sighting with a historical marker, or in this case, a werewolf with a historical marker. And I'm sure there's a lot of other authors who have dissected and unpacked the Snarly Yow better than I could. And I just thought, it's not exactly the West, but it is, the Old West time period. So why not throw it in the book? And it was, as you said, it's interesting. There's a lot to it. There's, the Civil War battle that might have somehow birthed it, or then there was a wizard from Germany that came here as an immigrant that they said he conjured it up. And it's, a lot of different origin stories for this thing.
Absolutely. It's fascinating, really, because I think sometimes it's easy to kind of dismiss some of these tales as sort of European folklore that's been sort of repackaged for the new American future for some of them. But clearly, there's obviously something that seems to take a life of its own, ironically, and sort of runs away from its origin story and seems to become a creature quite happy in its new American surroundings. And this seems to be one, because whilst it seems to have been quite prevalent in the late 19th century, I think you mentioned the last real flap or sighting of this particular creature is supposed to have been in the 1970s, wasn't it?
That's what I understand. I wouldn't be surprised if there's people out there in general who claim they've seen it, but that's the last major one that has any pedigree to it.
Ironically.
Yeah.
Not a dog monster if it's not got a good pedigree, surely.
Oh, that's true. I didn't realize. I didn't mean to make a pun, but I guess I did.
Hey, they're always the best ones, John. Marvellous.
Yeah.
I mean, as we touched on, surely one of the most famous supernatural denizens of North America, Central America, is La Llorona. And I was interested, because obviously you've recently done a book of this, La Llorona, Her Kith and Kin. And when you were doing the introduction, she's kind of got under your skin, it would seem, John, and taken you from being quite, it's a pretty run-of-the-mill ghost story, you've read one, you've read another, you've suddenly realised that you didn't really have access to everything else, and it's really opened up your eyes to see that she's actually quite important, is she not?
Yes, so La Llorona I wasn't interested in at all until I figured out or learned that she may have been Hernan Cortez's mistress, because that's just so crazy. And I think that got the ball rolling, and I wrote about her for the New Mexico Book of Witches, even though she's not really a witch. And I learned to appreciate her, if that's the right word. And I like to look for similarities in mythology the world over, and I found ways to kind of compare her to Lilith, which comes from Jewish apocrypha and folklore,
yes.
Which is, I think a lot of people today kind of know who Lilith is thanks to Supernatural, the TV series. That was a
yes.
character on there. But so I think La Llorona is just any type of bereaved woman, because back in the old days, women didn't have as many rights, and they really relied on men for survival, from a legal perspective, because again, they didn't have as many rights, and if you weren't married and you were, an old spinstress or whatever the old term was, people would kind of look down on you. Obviously, they would feel like a failure. So La Llorona, she typically is always a woman who was wronged by a man in some way. Usually she murders her own children, but not always. Sometimes her children die because of someone else, or she just has about 1 million different origin stories. They're all regional. They span across California to Colorado to New Mexico to Old Mexico, and they also span time periods too, because the one from California I found so interesting had her driving a car. She was just driving too fast along the road, and she went off the road into the river with her 2 kids in the car. So in that case, you've got a very modern La Llorona who I guess would have died in like the 50s or the 60s or something.
Yeah. That was the thing as well. When you were sort of doing your sort of introduction to her, this is the thing about this, is that it seems that everybody had a version of her. But obviously in those days, John, a lot of communities were 2, 3, 4 days ride at least from each other. Mm-hmm, so perhaps the cross-pollination of stories was harder. This wasn't impossible. And you would obviously occasionally get people marrying from different areas, and they would bring their stories and their histories together and sort of spread it that way. But it seems that the only thing that's constant about La Llorona, regardless of where you find her, is that she's usually just weeping and wailing. And even things like the colour she's wearing, the location you'll find her in, even her size. People have reported dwarf La Lloronas like a duende, and even gigantic ones up to sort of 9-10 feet tall.
Yeah, and then beyond that too, for some reason in Texas, they see La Llorona as a horse-headed woman. She has the head of a horse for some reason, and I think the backstory on that one is the horse head is another punishment for her crime to make her hideous in appearance. And then that also dovetails into completely kind of unrelated entities like the Donkey Lady of San Antonio, which was a woman, not exactly La Llorona, but it was a woman who died and then came back as like a half woman, half donkey. So that's why the book's called La Llorona, Her Kith and Kin. Kith and kin is a really antiquated term, but I like it. So it just means La Llorona, another ghost like her, which, the donkey woman certainly fits that category.
Was it surprising to see so many variations of her, though, John? Obviously, when we talk about certain characters and notable characters in folklore and legend and even belief, because there will be people out there who are steadfast in the belief of La Llorona. I'm not certainly being dismissive of anybody, and I have spoken with and discussed and experienced myself strange things that in normal conversation would seem completely out there, shall we say. And so was it remarkable in the fact that everywhere seemed to have a nuance? There was something that made it tethered to a certain place, like La Llorona in El Paso is not going to be the same as La Llorona in Albuquerque or Roswell or Santa Fe or anywhere. They would all have their version of it. It sort of all came under an umbrella of what it was, but she was different depending on where you found her.
Yeah, I totally hear what you're saying, because it's like it's like we believe some of these people who have these encounters, and yet their origin stories will also contradict each other. So sometimes I almost think of La Llorona as a type of ghost instead of an original like a distinctive ghost, like that's all her own, like there's just a bunch of different La Lloronas running around out there. And some of the witnesses even kind of use that terminology of they came across a Llorona as opposed to La Llorona singular, like they came across a type of Llorona or crying woman. So, maybe it's just a type of, female ghost who died in some violent or bereaved manner, and that's why you can always hear them crying.
I know one of the things that, this is the thing about when you speak about a particular character, because as I said before we sort of started talking about her in depth, John, you were quite sort of, and I understand that because my sort of early experience is exactly the same. I always thought, well, yeah, I've kind of heard this very similar kind of thing. But as with anything, the more you discover, the richer she becomes, I think. And it sort of transcends just a run-of-the-mill tragic ghost story to the point that certain places she has the ability to mimic. She appears differently. It's almost as if she has different supernatural powers depending on that. I always chuckle about the one where an appearance from La Llorona was able to turn the drunkest man sober overnight, John.
Yeah, so that's where they put her to use, I think, for different purposes. If you don't want your kids to play too close to the water, then, you emphasize that aspect that she's going to pull you under. But then if you don't want your husband to go out and be drunk and unfaithful, you tell the story of the man who saw her, out in the alley somewhere and got scared to death. And that's another one of her different appearances is in Mexico City, where she wanders around and she's just a skeleton woman wearing a dress.
Well, this is the other thing as well. She doesn't even appear the same. Like you say, some would say she's a beautiful woman. Some would say she appears as a kind of amalgamation of creatures. Some would say she's an old woman. But then you've also got skeletons. She's super tall. She's super short. She's wearing white. She's wearing black. It's remarkable how it's similar but very different depending on whose version you hear, John.
Yes, and for, I always want to get to the truth of it because a lot of these are just stories, but I don't feel like they can all just be stories. Some people have had real actual encounters, and I want to know what commonalities does it have with the other sightings that might be real?
Absolutely. She's clearly got a real sort of power over Hispanic culture, it would seem, as well, because, there's been reports in the past of cults being formed with her being their deity even, and they create songs and ceremonies to celebrate her life and her teachings, which to some would seem remarkable because most of the teachings we seem to be able to garner from her story is don't go near the water and don't drink alcohol. So I'm not really sure what more you can do there.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and who gets utilized in the same way and that's why I include her in the book as well, as a type of owl witch called La Chuza, which is like a giant owl with the face of a woman, and it's the same origin story as a lady's kid was killed, or actually in that one I think the lady's kid was killed by a drunk driver, and so she came back as this avenging owl witch that targets drunk drivers and stuff like that.
Well, yes. I think when I was reading the book, I'm trying, like you say, sometimes my memory fails me, but I'm sure, was it Albuquerque that used her on a public sort of service campaign that they had?
Yes, it was, yeah. They used La Llorona, yeah.
Because they were having a spate of kids who were drowning in sort of culverts and things. This is one of those things that even in this day and age, hot days, and I would imagine Albuquerque gets a lot hotter than England at the best of times, John. The temptation to jump into a body of water when you're a young kid on school holidays is sometimes overpowering. And unfortunately, sometimes places are not as calm and as tranquil as they seem beneath the surface.
Yes, that's absolutely true. Even I played in irrigation ditches when I was little in Fort Sumner, and that was, kind of dangerous depending on how big you were because the water could sweep you away. So yeah, it was a real danger, that's for sure.
Do you think she's become one of those beliefs, those traditions that seems to transcend her origin now? John, and it's become such a mixed bag that it's going to be really difficult to unpick where she came from, and we should just appreciate her in the modern era? Or do you think that there is kernels of truth squirreled away at the bottom of all this?
Both. I think from the kernels of truth have grown all of these wild variations, so it's almost impossible to pick through them to get to the root. And then I was thinking, too, because we mentioned Lilith earlier on Supernatural, and it dawned on me that Supernatural's first episode, I think, was La Llorona. They just didn't call her La Llorona. It was just a woman in white, that came out of the river. So, I mean, the fact that she was Supernatural's debut episode really says something about her legacy, I think.
Yes, it is. Yeah, I remember that. And she was trying to get one of them to drive their car into a wall or something, so she could be with him in the afterlife.
Yeah.
That was her calling card. She liked to kill attractive young men, John. So I'd be all right, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't think she'd be chasing me down the street. Well, I'm going to hold on to that and hope for the best. But it shows you. Sometimes I'm really sort of disappointed often when I see sort of supernatural or paranormal dramas, because they tend to seem to be written by people who only have a passing interest or don't really know it. And one of the things that's always struck me about Supernatural is they seem to really know what they were trying to cover, or the characters and the creatures and the legends they were trying to utilize as sort of plot points in the series throughout it. And like you say, it was quite a brave step to start that, because usually you would think first one you would probably go for something more well known, or something you could utilize and speak of in a more widely appreciated sort of understanding to the viewers. But they just went, hey, we're just going to go with this.
Yeah, and two, I think writers love to research, even though they're writing a fictional story. There's something so fun about cherry picking what you like from the real stuff and using it in the fictional story. And that's probably another reason I'm attracted to La Llorona at the moment, is I think I want to use her in a story at some point, and I don't even know where to begin, though, because there's so much to her.
Well, I suppose that's a good thing, because you can take what you wish.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, well, it almost makes it tonally different in a story. It makes it tonally difficult for a story, because there's stories that make La Llorona out to be a vampire that drinks blood, and then there's stories that make her out to be more of like a 1980s slasher. That was the one from Arizona where she would cut you up with an axe. There's just anything you want. You can put any attributes you want onto La Llorona, because that legend has just gotten so big. Yeah,
absolutely. It's almost as if she becomes whatever people want you to be afraid of.
Yeah, and I think there's also okay. So you and I, we're nerds for monsters. Like. We know the difference between a skinwalker and a European werewolf and a dogman. A dogman is totally different from a skinwalker, right? Mm-hmm. Like, we know all these nuances, but the general public does not. So for them, they'll just attribute whatever name they know to a certain ghost. Like any female ghost could be La Llorona, just because it's a woman. Mm. Whereas it may have nothing to do with her at all. So the nerds like us, we know how to classify these monsters, and the general public, they just use a very general term, and that's how these things get so confused.
Yes, absolutely. I often see people glass over when they start talking about things in normal conversation, and I just go off.
Yeah.
Now then, are you talking about werewolves or Dogman? And they're like, hang on, what was the difference? Ah, well, that's before we even mentioned the Guru. And then they just walk away.
Yeah.
Not enough of this, I'm off. Well, John, listen, thank you as always for diving into some of your recent works and some of the fabulous stories you've uncovered. And as always, we've given people a tasty morsel or two of them to go out and get hold of a copy of both of these and dive into them. And as always, your love of history and your love of uncovering wonderful stories shines through both volumes that we've discovered. So what's next for you? You're a man with many interests and a love of writing and research, John. So where are you going next?
Well, thank you. I think what's most pertinent pertinent to this podcast is I've got a book coming out later this summer called Haunted Lincoln County, New Mexico, which is all about the ghosts of Billy the Kid and La Llorona in Lincoln County, where I'm, live nearby. And then we were talking, in the green room, so to speak. I've also got a book that might be out by the time this episode is posted. It's all about the James Bond movies. It's called Developing 007, and it's how closely the scripts would follow Ian Fleming's books and how they would change. And, as the title implies, it's all about that developmental process. And I guess the only other thing I'd love to mention is I'm trying really hard to build up my Instagram brand account, and I've been posting some really cool composites on there from the books, just of these really neat images of different cryptids and UFOs and ghosts and that sort of thing. So if you'd like to see some just cool stuff once a day, it's John LeMay Books on Instagram.
Fabulous. Well, I'll put links to everything so everybody can track you down. And obviously, James Bond has an ardent fan base all around the world, as I've seen over the last couple of months on social media, with a lot of my friends complaining about the new Amazon deal. So who knows what will happen? Strangely enough, my favourite James Bond film is obviously the most supernatural one, which is Live and Let Die.
I knew it. I knew that was going to be it. Yeah.
I'm so easy to read sometimes. But I also like The Man with the Golden Gun. But that, once again, I think that's got to do with who plays the baddie.
Yeah, I knew that. Yeah.
So listen, I'll put links to everything in your Instagram, and I'll make sure I'm following you on all my platforms as well, my friend, because there's nothing I like more than a bit of folklore and some wonderful imagery to go with it, my man. And I just want to say thank you very much. Hopefully we shall speak soon. I look forward to the new Supernatural book, and as always, I wish you the very best with all your projects, and we will speak soon, John.
Thank you, Paul. I enjoyed it.